Hello, everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. And I'm excited to bring you a precision medicine discussion, a topic that I've wanted this stuff to become a reality for such a long time. And I think a lot of people in healthcare have. And so I'm excited to, see where we're at in the progress of precision medicine. And today, my guest is Joel Diamond. He's co-founder and CMO at To Be Precise. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks. So before we begin, tell us a little bit about yourself and To Be Precise.
Sure. Well, I'm Joel Diamond. I am a family medicine by background. I've been practicing family medicine going on 30 years now. Whenever I say that, it makes me cringe a little bit to think how old I am. I've been involved in healthcare informatics for a good deal of that time. To Be Precise is a company we started a few years ago that deals with bringing genomics and genomic insights to the point of care.
Awesome. Well, I've heard really good things about you. So it's my first time interviewing To Be Precise. So excited to learn more. But, of course, we have to hit the elephant in the room, which really is how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted healthcare's interest in genetics and genomics in general?
Well, it's been a double-edged sword. Interestingly, on one hand, the pandemic has sucked all the oxygen out of the room. And healthcare systems really are consumed with just how they deal with the day-to-day stuff, but haven't neglected where they need to move, and this is eventually going to happen very, very quickly. The other part of that double-edged sword is people are very, very quickly realizing what we've known for a long time, and that is patients behave differently to the same thing. So why is it that some people in this pandemic got incredibly sick? Why is it that some people had mostly respiratory symptoms? Why did people have all sorts of vascular conditions? And it probably is some genetic differences in susceptibility to this disease and the expression of the disease.
So would you just describe it as like an explosion of genetics and genomic interest if it relates to COVID, but if it doesn't relate to COVID, that it's been put on hold or kind of sucked the air?
Yeah, that's beautifully put. That's exactly right. As in most things in medicine right now, in my own practice, a lot of doctors are saying, what happened to all the strokes and heart attacks that we normally see this time of year? And they're probably happening, but a lot of people are staying home, and a lot of this is in the background.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, that's a whole nother discussion about the second wave, or are they just going to die, which is even, a little sad. But anyway, it's great that there's a focus on genomics, because I think you're right. We are just starting to understand how genomics impacts an individual, whether it's a treatment, whether it's what other form is being applied, whether pharmacogenomics. So in what areas can genomics be really particularly valuable during these patient encounters, especially in the current environment with COVID, obviously taking center stage?
Well, one of them is, you mentioned it, which is pharmacogenomics, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Taking all the, I'll say, nonsense, and be careful how I said this about medications for treating COVID. We've heard a lot about hydroxychloroquine as an example of that. But if we take everything out of that, there is a drug that we know that certain individuals have a genetic predisposition to do very poorly on that drug. So as we start evaluating treatments and other things, if we stratify patients better based on genetic susceptibility, and this is how we should approach drug development in general, we'll have a lot more clarity around this whole subject. And I think just the whole idea of medication safety, the people that are sick with this disease, the sickest, I should say, with this disease, are the people with lots of comorbidity that are on polypharmacy, and getting this stuff right, reducing the chances of adverse drug reactions, is a noble goal on any day of the week, let alone during a pandemic when people are critically ill.
So do you see that with the pharma companies, that they're incorporating genetics as part of the drug making and testing process? I mean, we've seen it with COVID, right? And trying to figure out what are the things that maybe we should try and what drugs should we try. But like, it almost feels like they need to do it throughout the whole process, but maybe I guess it's not in their best interest, because if they do it generally, they can apply it to everyone, and that's more profitable. It's our, I'm known to call out the profit side.
Well, yes and no. I mean, while you bring out the profit side of things, it was interesting. A pharmaceutical rep came to my office a while back and was promoting awareness in a rare disease, a very rare disease. And I said, "This is strange. Why are you doing this?" And she said, "Well, we happen to have the one drug that treats this disease." And I said, "Well, it's very noble that you're doing this." And I went home and I looked up the drug, and I saw the cost of the drug was $750,000 for the first year of treatment, so almost $1 million overall for treatment. And I did realize what you said is you can go from selling 1 million drugs for $1 a piece, or you could sell one drug for $1 million, and it's the same profit either way. And I think that's one of the areas that people are looking at with this. But in reality, it's interesting. More and more, I just prescribed a new migraine drug to a patient recently, and looking at the package insert, the first half of the package insert was all about pharmacogenomics and said, CYP2D, whatever drug should be considered. Now, the problem, of course, is most doctors understand drug-drug interaction, but probably don't understand drug-gene interaction very much. But we're seeing that more and more, and I think more FDA approval of drugs happen to have pharmacogenomics as part of that as well.
So why is it that type of precision medicine, right? And even, I think pharmacogenomics is one aspect of precision medicine. Why isn't that being adopted more broadly by doctors? And is it that the health systems can't see the value in it? Is it a data problem? What's really holding us back there?
It's kind of all of the above. It's one of it is out of sight, out of mind. So we could practice medicine and we could be very, very good doctors for the most part without thinking about genetics. On the other hand, it's amazing. As I said, I'm a family doctor, but I'm also in the field of genetics. And more, I see patients in my office with genetic-based diseases. Now, did I happen to just see those patients, or was I not recognizing them before? A lot of that. The flip side of it is, I also think that if we look at things like susceptibility to cancer or other diseases, not putting those in the forefront becomes unconscionable, right? So we don't think nowadays that a middle-aged woman coming in for a wellness visit, I want to make sure that she's had a mammogram, a colonoscopy, et cetera. But do I take an adequate family history and see if she should have a genetic test for BRCA, which actually may be much more important as an example of that. So one of the problems, I think, is the technology piece. And much like other technologies, listen, electronic prescribing came out a while before it was widely adopted. And the reason it wasn't, not because doctors didn't think it was a good idea, but it wasn't within their workflow. And I think that's one of the problems today. We have lots of workflows for other technologies incorporating regular labs, radiology, et cetera, into our workflow, but the genetic data tends to be separate. There aren't good standards around it. The results usually come back as a document that's not codified, that can be used like other data sources. And I think that's one of the big problems today. And then finally, I still think there's a huge gap in our learning. Most of us learned genetics in medical school a long time ago, and the explosion of data that's happened is incredible. The deciphering of the human genome, was done in 2003. Now that's still a long time from today, but it's still even longer from some physicians' time that they took genetics in medical school.
That's a good point. I mean, how do you? I mean, we have this problem in healthcare in general. How do you disperse the overwhelming amount of medical information and discovery that's happening to doctors? My answer is it has to be coded into the technology. Is that really the solution? I mean, sure, there's continuing education and all that, but how far can that scale up, right? I mean, the only way to scale, as one person told me, the body of medical knowledge is so complex that the human mind can't comprehend it. So, I think we're there. And you add in genomics, and we're way past that, right?
Well, it's a great point. I was showing somebody the other day my 12th edition of Harrison's Textbook of Medicine. I was showing it to them because it was co-authored by Anthony Fauci and
Okay.
talking about that. But the idea of going to a textbook and reading about a disease that's based on literature that was probably old even before that book got published isn't the case anymore. You can Google stuff, but that's not the way to do it either. So there has to be a lot more clinical decision support at the point of care. From my philosophy, the knowledge base is changing on a very, very rapid basis. And that knowledge base has to be hooked into our clinical systems. So when I see a condition, something needs to inform me and say, hey, maybe this is a genetic condition. I have a gene over here, by the way, from a previous test. Maybe it's related. And here's the latest science on whether that applies to this or not. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to have systems that can offer that clinical decision support, but it has to be attached to multiple knowledge sources, and we have to be able to do that real time and in a dynamic way.
Yeah, so let's dive into some of those details. And interestingly enough, to be precise, was acquired by Allscripts, which has a few different EHRs as well. So and that's where we come from as well at Healthcare IT Today, is the EHR world. So what is the role of the EHR in bringing that genomics into the clinical workflow? It's interesting, we kind of talked about it from a clinical decision support side of things, but it seems like you also need to store the data, which I think a lot of EHR vendors haven't grasped that as well. Like, how do I store it? Do I store the genomic data? Do I store the report? Do I, what do I need to store? So, how are you navigating that, and how do you think that should be navigated by an EHR vendor?
Yeah, so it's a great point, and I kind of take that apart in a couple ways. First of all, the storing the data in itself has some complexity. I often say to people, be careful what you wish for. Do you want all the genetic data stored inside the EHR? Well, the reality is that when we do genetic testing today, we get something called variants of unknown significance. Those VUSs mean that here's a gene, it seems abnormal, it seems like it's going to do something, but science hasn't figured it out yet. Now, I don't want that information sitting in my EMR ready for a year from now when somebody says it causes X, Y, and Z. How am I going to find that, look at it, look at my population of patients? I am sure there's a cottage industry of malpractice attorneys who are already all over that stuff. So I do believe that data has to sit above the EMR, but has to inject itself within the EHR as I know it, and I need to be informed when, again, as we spoke earlier, that knowledge changes and that variant of unknown significance actually becomes of significance, as an example. I also have to have the ability, as I said earlier too, that if I have a clinical condition, maybe I'm seeing a patient with very high cholesterol, I've treated them with multiple drugs, and I'm not really knowing that there is a condition called familial hyperlipidemia, and I wouldn't know which genetic test to even order for that. So I have to have some decision support around ordering the right test or looking at the right test. So that has to be at the point of care, but I think there's a lot of difficulty in what the EHR's role. And finally, not to belabor the point, but I talked to a CMIO of a very, very large health system. He says, I don't even know what genetic data I have in my system because most of it's unstructured and it's sitting in a file somewhere in a folder in a document tree labeled other. So I don't even know what doctors in my organization are ordering, let alone liberating that data and making it useful. And the sin of that, of course, is that if we were to do a whole genome on any of us, the reality is we would test once and we would query often and regularly for our whole lives and never need to repeat that test again. That's where we are scientifically, but our EHR systems aren't quite ready to handle that data and make it available.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's still a lot of work there. I think if we asked most doctors, do you do much with genomics? I think their answer would be no. But how do you guys approach it at To Be Precise in integrating with the EHR? Do you sit above it? Is it integrated? Is it, do you have a separate platform? What's your approach?
So a couple things. One is we've worked very, very hard at that last mile of making the data appear as if it's in the EHR. In fact, we're very happy for the end user not to know there's this thing called To Be Precise. we believe that we need to be agnostic to the EHR, and we need to figure out how to be in that workflow. Sometimes we do that with a tab within the EHR. Sometimes we have a little floating icon that they can click on that informs them there's some genetic information. And sometimes we'll do some very deep integration with different types of EMRs. It doesn't matter to us as long as the end user thinks that they're working in their workflow all the time. So if they're looking at a medication list, we want to inform them that some of those medicines may have a pharmacogenomic implication. If they're an oncologist taking care of cancer patients and they've done somatic testing on that patient's tumor, we want those results to be as discrete value that they can look at and help inform them of that. At the same time, we also believe we have to be agnostic to those knowledge sources that I talked about. So we're also looking at those knowledge sources in the cloud and informing the end user both with their results of the genetic tests and new knowledge. And then finally, the very hard part is you have to do the very difficult work of marrying genotype to phenotype. So all that clinical information that sits there, we have to be able to pull that in real time. And that's why we believe in doing this above the EMR, having a very deep ontology and data model to be able to harmonize that data and then be able to serve it up to the clinician at the point of care.
That's awesome. And yeah, the number one thing I tell EHR vendors when I'm talking about why they need an API is I say, you're not doing genomics. So you like you have to have one because you need to be able to integrate genomics in the future. Yeah, that is the reality. It's interesting you talk about the ontologies and the various, I would say almost genetic insights that you can make available. Do you have any idea, like, what percentage do we have? Are we 1% of it evaluated? Are we 10%? Are we 30%? I mean, it feels like it's in the early single digits as far as what we have, but that probably represents tens of thousands of insights, right?
Yeah, I think we're incredibly in the infancy stage here. I mean, we know there's monogenetic diseases where there's one disease in it, one gene, and it causes a disease. We are very much in our infancy in understanding polygenic risk for disease, an example. But on the other hand, how is it today that we routinely prescribe a drug like Plavix post-MI, knowing that maybe 20% of those patients are rapid metabolizers of that drug? Why aren't we using genetic insights to help us in a case like that? Or in the case of behavioral health, the idea of just picking antidepressants out of a hat, trying, waiting, increasing dose, third drug, and then finally maybe a different class of drugs, when we can retrospectively look back and say, oh my God, that patient never had a chance because they metabolized this drug poorly. So I think those areas we're farther ahead than we should be, but we don't have the ability to incorporate that in workflow. And then I think there's other areas where people probably are not thinking about it. I think about conditions like cardiomyopathy. If we were to stratify a population and say, well, let's look at the patients that have dilated cardiomyopathy, a large percent of those patients have a genetic cause of that. And in fact, their treatment and the way we stratify those patients can be vastly different than others. And I think this applies across the board for most specialties.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think in my opinion, the only way to solve that is getting it into the EHR so the doctor can see it in their clinical workflow and know that these options are available.
I couldn't agree more. Preaching to the converted.
Well, luckily we'll have a broader audience. Hopefully they'll hear it as well. What are some of the common misconceptions about genetic and genomic testing? My favorite is the difference between a consumer genetic test and a medical one. But
it's a good place to start out with that on both sides. The consumer and doctors today still think that consumer test means a lot of things. So a lot of people say, well, I'm going to get this consumer test and it's going to tell me X, Y, and Z. And aside from telling you that you have red hair and you like caffeine better, and maybe be surprised by some of your ancestry, that's not the same as having a genetic panel or a full exome or full genome and understanding those risks. I think the next stage of that is understanding, to your point about a consumer-based test, is the difference between having some abnormal genes and actually getting a disease. I had my full exome done a few years ago, and I always tell people I had something like 39 pathological variants. And I say, and here I am, I didn't die. And when you go through all of those, a lot of those were diseases of infancy that, thank goodness, I never got.
I never have.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the cause and effect part, I think, is the other part. And then, the idea of doing a consumer test, which is not a CLIA certified test, and versus a CLIA lab doing a test that's medical grade is the other part of it. So I think the idea of looking at a SNP that determines a trait that's based on some gene-wide association studies versus really knowing genes and what they do and what they code for and what disease might be associated. I think the other misconceptions continue to be around cost. I think people still think this costs a gazillion dollars. The reality is with genetic testing is I don't think there's been a technology in the history of mankind that has come down in cost as rapidly as this. The human genome, the first time the human genome was deciphered, it took $3 billion to uncode the entire genome. And today we're talking about, 2003. And, now here we are, people are offering full genomes below $1,000 and probably will be a couple $100. So, compared to other tests that we do repeatedly, a CBC or a lipid profile that, we do over and over and over again. Here's a test you do once, extrapolate that cost over a lifetime, and it's less than pennies. So I think cost is another single misconception that people have today too. And the last one, I think, is the privacy issue. And I get it, and I understand that, and who owns this data, and where does it belong? But other areas, if you have just the pharmacogenomic portion of your gene done, nobody's going to be able to, trace your crimes or, understand the child that you didn't have or paternity or things like that. These are just, small areas of the gene that don't reveal anything else about us. So I think we have to a lot more education, not just to the consumer, but to clinicians as well.
Yeah, well, that discussion is really raging as Ancestry just sold to a private equity firm. And they're all afraid of the privacy implications. And I'm like, I mean, there are some implications, don't get me wrong, and it should be used appropriately and we should hold them accountable, but I think it's overstated, kind of maybe, what the risk is of losing it. Although there is a point, you can't change your genome, right? It is what it is.
It is what it is. I do think the piece that really needs to be examined is the data rights. And I think that applies not just to genomics, but almost everything that we do. Every time we sign the okay when we download an app, we don't realize where all that information may or may not be going and who owns it and how it's being bought and sold. And I think that is true with some of this genetic data as well. And so having consumers, I think, understand that and have more ownership of their data is going to be an important factor going forward.
Yeah, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have predicted that a legislation around privacy, everything that we're talking about here, consumer privacy, was coming out. It's amazing how that got hijacked. But one last question: what do you see happening really with precision medicine and genomics in the next few years?
Yeah, I think this exponential increase in knowledge is not stopping at all, and it's truly exponential. So I think we're going to see giant breakthroughs in a lot of diseases. If you look at just cancer care and what's happened, and the idea of saying, okay, we based cancer treatment based on the anatomical region of that cancer, and now we say, we're curing people of diseases we never thought we would have because of the molecular basis, not the anatomical site. It tells us that a lot of things that we labeled as a disease are really hundreds, if not thousands, of different diseases. And those molecular insights, I think, are going to change medicine in many ways. You're starting to see these immunotherapies, for things like irritable bowel syndrome and psoriasis and other autoimmune diseases. And the last bastion, the wilderness of medicine, to me is psychiatry, of a field that really needs some rigor to it. And I think we're going to start understanding the genetic basis of neurological diseases and behavioral health issues as well. And I do believe that genetics is going to play a giant role in that. And I'm hopeful that will be the case as well. And I also hope that we're going to make big inroads in the prevention part of this. We always talk about the treatment part of it, but understanding our risk factors to diseases is going to go a long way in making people change behaviors. I think if you know that you have a predisposition for something, it makes it a lot more urgent for you to change your lifestyle and do what you can to minimize the other polygenic factors in that disease.
Nice. And yeah, that's interesting. That's bringing the science together with the marketing and behavioral, sides of things. That is really interesting.
I hope so.
It should to be effective, I think. But I love it. That's a great way to frame it. We have an exponential increase of discovery, and we have the near exponential, I think, decrease in cost. And that, we're right at that pivot point, which is really beautiful. So thanks for sharing insights. I appreciate it. We've been here with Joel Diamond, co-founder and CMO at 2Be4Precise. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, check it out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you very much. Great being with you.